that, me talking for 10 to 15 minutes. For those of you who know me, I'll go, that's incredible. If I can manage that, I'll be surprised. He's always got something to talk about when it comes to risk. Anyway, yeah, so thanks for having me back, Peter, first of all. I think the last time we did the Holy Trinity twice, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
It was so popular. So for those of you who don't know what the Holy Trinity is, I won't go into it in too much detail because I'm sure you can download the actual recording that we did and have a listen. But I talk about risk in largely 3 dimensions. It's a triumvirate. Of course, there's strategic objectives, which we're all familiar with, and the things we're looking to achieve. But invariably then, there, of course, there are strategic risks that come along with those objectives, the things that could undermine the achievement of those objectives. And coupled and almost running alongside that is our appetite for risk, the type of risk that we're prepared to engage with and not. And I actually think often those 3 items should be really closely aligned. They should not be divorced from each other. And I often find in organisations they are. Strategic objectives are in one part, strategic risk, if we want to call it strategic risk, somewhere else, and then risk appetite, well, that's over there somewhere else. And some folk haven't even got to grips with that at all. And in many cases, there's no reason why they shouldn't have, because I actually think risk appetite is a really slippery subject. And I think I use the word slippery because a lot of folk use different words to describe what is risk appetite, and we see the words risk attitude and risk tolerance start to play through. I'm no academic necessarily. I don't get excited too much about what words we're using. I'm more interested in the intention. And what I mean by that is what a board is looking to achieve and the amount of risk that it might absorb or take on. So I always think about this. All organisations are exposed to risk, and that's, you know, whatever part, whatever sector you're involved in. And I always think the question is, what type of risk and how much risk is an organisation prepared to take in the pursuit of its objectives? That's what I'm always interested in. I think that's a really neat question to ask and something to think about when it comes to risk appetite. And I think if we understand that, then we're in a better position to make decisions. I have a lot of organisations say to me, particularly board level, why should we understand our risk appetite? And my answer is, why not? Because I actually think it's a good conversation to have around the boardroom table. Because each one of us on this call, potentially if we were in a boardroom, could have a very different attitude or appetite for risk. But I think as an organisation and a collective as a whole, we need to understand what that is and what that means. And then we need to be able to articulate that, and we need to be able to annotate that in some way, in some form of risk appetite statement. I'm going to talk about those towards the end because that formed part of the questionnaire that we sent out in connection with how COVID-19 has impacted on organisational risk appetite. And that's what I'm going to talk about today specifically. But I'm going to come back to the risk appetite statement at the end for some things to think about there. So we did a survey in RSM across some of our clients, and this survey is still in play. So I'm going to relay some of those results to you today. It was a quite simple survey we put forward in connection with COVID, and we largely asked 5 questions. We asked, as a result of COVID-19, has your board or organisation reviewed its risk appetite? Straightforward question. The other question we then asked was, has your board, organisation risk appetite changed as a result of COVID-19? Reasonably straightforward. Our next question was actually, in what way has your board, organisation risk appetite changed as a result of COVID-19? And we then asked for some descriptions around that, and we got some various responses. The next question we asked was, how has the change in board and organisation risk appetite been reflected in the way in which decisions are made and services delivered to customers? Please describe. And we had some various examples come back on that. And I'm gonna explain some of those responses and talk about some of those because they are varied in many ways, but there were some common themes and some things for you to think about maybe in your organisation. Our final question was more of a traditional type question. The risk appetite of the board, if this has been defined, has it been communicated across the organisation in the form of a risk appetite statement? Okay, so 5 questions. Let's start with question 1. As a result of COVID-19, has your board and organisation reviewed its risk appetite? Okay, 43% of those that participated in the survey so far said yes, they had as a result of COVID-19, reviewed its risk appetite. Okay? So that means they've undertaken a review of some kind, looked at it and considered the implications of COVID-19 on the appetite of the organisation. 57% said they're not. I don't know whether that's a good or bad. There is no right or wrong answer here necessarily. Just for you to think about in this instance. I'll give you my views as we go along towards the end. Question 2 was, has your board or organisation risk appetite changed as a result of COVID-19? Has it changed? 35% said it had, but 50% said it hadn't, and 15% said they didn't know. Okay. So then we get into the bit of the nitty gritty now, to be honest, and this is a bit more interesting. So if we think about our third question, which I replayed earlier on, which I said earlier on, is in what way has your board organisation risk appetite changed as a result of COVID-19? So I'm going to bring you through some key outcomes of that. I'll have to open my phone on this because I've got some notes written down on here. Can't do it from memory, terrible. There we go. So in response to question 3, there was sort of 3 main themes that came out of here. I'm not sure I necessarily answered question 3, but these are sort of the responses we were getting. So question was, in what ways your board or organisation risk appetite changed as a result of COVID-19? A lot of the respondents said they'd actually reviewed the causes and effects of the risks, take into account the COVID dynamic. And this had led to changes in risk scoring. And as a result of that, there was potentially new mitigations they were taking. That was due to the fact that they were now facing a greater level of risk exposure. So does that mean they've exceeded their risk appetite? In my interpretation, I'm saying yes, potentially they had, because they're now doing more as a result of it to address it. But I quite like that, and I thought that was quite interesting, because I wrote an article about COVID-19 and risk and in the early stages, and I actually mentioned in there that I think organisations should review their risk profile for any new event that emerges, be it COVID-19 or anything else in the future, and the implications that will have on their risk profile. I don't think you should necessarily be sitting there and putting COVID-19, as I alluded to in the previous session, into your risk register as a risk alone. COVID-19 is playing through all of your risks and has implications on all of them. And therefore, you see the change in risk profile, and therefore, as that changes, the exposure changes, and you may exceed your risk appetite. But what seems to be the common theme here is risk appetite hasn't actually formally changed. Although what we are seeing in the responses is there seems to be an attitude change, because invariably what happens is corporately, as organisations, they get nervous as a result of something that's occurred that is causing them a problem. And that's a natural reaction, whether this is COVID-19 or a hole in your balance sheet that suddenly starts to appear. Organisations who may be quite bullish in their attitude retrench. That's the natural effect of an organisation corporately in its risk attitude. Does it mean its appetite is necessarily changed? I think it does change. I think what we're seeing here is actually a playthrough into the risk profile, and organisations saying, whoa, I'm a little bit more nervous about that nowadays. It's creating a bigger implication for our organisation and our objectives. So that was quite interesting, I thought. Something that also came through in this question was a lot of organisations are now talking about the fact that they intend to undertake a lot more formal horizon scanning. Now, a lot of boards I work with do this perhaps once a year. They get together, they go to a nice hotel in some cases, and they spend time thinking about the future and strategizing. In fact, I was talking to a CEO who said they were only doing that just the other day, and he said, but we're going to make that a much more regular feature. In fact, we're going to drive it through into our board discussions on a more regular basis and our leadership discussions as a management team, because we need to get a better grip on what's occurring, what's out there, what's coming towards us, and the implications for our organisation. To me, that's actually a change in attitude, and potentially will change their risk appetites. Their appetite will shift as they start to understand these better. And I'm talking about the corporate appetite there. And when we get onto the risk appetite statement, I'll explain a little bit more about levels of appetite and also themes of appetite, because I think appetite doesn't exist wholly as one. But I think corporately, when the board think about it, then it does, if that makes sense. And it's interesting, the final point that seemed to come through on question 3, which is in what ways your board and organisation risk appetite changed. The other feature that comes through here is that the respondents are saying we need to understand better our behaviours, our culture of our organisation. Our culture's been hanging around for something that organisations have been trying to get a grip on for quite a while now. And I think it's really important because it drives behaviours, it drives the way in which you make decisions. You know, it is that sort of, perhaps in some ways it's the tone from the top, But I think it's more than that, actually, because now what organisations are talking about is we want to understand our corporate resilience. And that's really interesting, because I think what they're looking at now and thinking, well, if we as an organisation want to make sure we can overcome these events in the future, then how resilient is our organisation in the normal terms of financial standing and other aspects, but also individuals in our business? What does that mean to them? Because what happens if we have a lot of individuals who, not because of illness or whatever, because of COVID, but literally can't take that kind of type of pressure and fall over or start making irrational decisions? And so it's starting to change the whole dynamic and thought around risk appetite. Whereas, risk appetite once was just very much, let's define our risk appetite, write it down, put it in a statement. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but now we're actually starting to see it's a lot more emotional in many ways. And there's a number of different aspects that are playing through into it that alter the way in which we think about our appetite for risk. It's not a one-dimensional type thing. There are a lot of things you have to consider. And that's why it's slippery in my mind. It's really difficult to get to grips with, but I think it's a good conversation to be had. So just moving on to our fourth question, which was in connection with how has the change in board organisation risk appetite reflected in the way in which decisions are made and services delivered to customers? This provided, again, a few common themes that came through. There were some quite granular, obviously, responses to the survey, which you would expect. And I might talk about those now. So one of them was about the fact that there seems to be an attitude, which is we're going to spend more. We're going to spend not spend our way out of it, but we're going to have to spend more to address the issues on a more micro level. The other one was about the fact that there was a need to be more sympathetic to the circumstances of customers and suppliers and other stakeholders. So there was perhaps a change in attitude that was occurring there. And they were quite sort of, but at a more macro level, what we were starting to see there is, and it probably links to what I've just said there, but a measurement of risk and implications of decisions that are being made on our services and our customers. Now, it's really interesting because I always think that organisations consider risk anyway, but maybe, maybe a lot of organisations consider risk, how can I say, because they have to. I have seen reports that go to committees where there are risk implications included, but I think actually now organisations are thinking a little bit more clearly around what does this really mean. And if we use appetite as the driver rather than what are the risks, then we might actually be in a better decision to determine whether we engage with that type of risk or not. So that was quite interesting. So more informed assessment and measurement of the risk with regard to decisions that were being made. Going back to the thing around horizon scanning, what we were seeing there was a need to model services more so for the future. A general acceptance that things are going to change as a result of COVID, be it COVID or any other event, things will change. And some organisations now are taking time to look at what that change will mean and implications for the organisation. It seems quite obvious, of course, but what they're suggesting now is that should become a regular feature, not because of COVID, but we start to make that as part of our regular feature. Can we change our services in what way? Regularly challenging the way in which we do things. The other aspect that we've seen come through, of course, as a result of the COVID event, and going back to the point being how is this reflected in the way in which decisions are being made, there is a greater need for information and there has been a greater need for meetings. And that potentially might be just of a sort of response to the COVID event, but actually there's a desire to get more informed evidence to make decisions on. I really strongly believe boards make decisions based on not a great deal of evidence. I think there's a lot of emotional responses in boards. And I think now they're just starting to get to that point where they're saying we need more information. We need to make a much more informed decision. Think about the boards you work with, okay? Think about the non-executives, think about the executives, which many of you will be. And there is an element of being able to talk a good game around the boardroom table. I've done that myself, I'll admit it on this call. And invariably, there is situations where people are making decisions based not on evidence, but on what they believe is evidence. And often it's assumption, and it's not been triangulated, and often it's emotional. I have no problem with emotional decision making, but it needs to include also some evidence base on which it's being made. And I think that's coming to the fore now because organisations are starting to say, as a result of COVID, maybe we didn't understand as much about our organisation, the way we interacted with our clients as we thought we might do. And that's been interesting. So anyway, so that sort of responses we got to the questions where we were delving into the detail a little bit more. Our fourth question, of course, comes back to the has the board defined and communicated its risk appetite in the form of a risk appetite statement? And there was, as I said to you earlier, there was quite a large level of response that said yes, we had, but then equally 43% said they hadn't. Now, I actually think a risk appetite statement, although it's just a document, I think is actually a good thing to have. Why do I think it's a good thing to have? Because risk appetite is made up of obviously the level of appetite that you might have with regards to a theme of risk that exists in association with achievement of your objectives. So I was talking about appetite, of course, just now about the corporate whole, but I think when you're defining risk appetite more precisely, you can't just say, as an organisation, we have a low risk appetite. I think what you've got to look at is the types of themes, and these are quite broad brush themes that invariably you want to communicate out to your organisation and say, these are the sort of things we want to engage with or not engage with. We're either going to be very averse to this sort of stuff on a spectrum through to being very hungry to engage in this type of risk. But I can't even use the word risk. I think it's more of a collective bucket of stuff. And for those of you who worked with me in the past will know I use the word stuff when I can't come up with a better word, because they're an amalgam of things that you need considering there. But I think defining those themes and understanding the level of exposure that you might be potentially prepared to take, I think is a really good way to communicate out to your organisation and to your stakeholders with regards to where you're at from a risk appetite point of view. You can also, of course, weave this into the way in which decision-making papers are taken to committee. It's much better to say, in the context of our risk appetite, then invariably, how well can we make this decision? What does it mean to us? Rather than just saying, what are the risks? Because invariably you can list off all those risks and it still doesn't mean anything to you because they're just a list of risks. So do it in the context of your risk appetite if you've defined it. So I was looking through some risk appetite statements that I'd helped prepare. And of course, with the risk appetite statement that you put out, you can also use that to better inform and drive your reporting on risk. So, of course, risks all get put on your risk matrix. You've got your impact and likelihood, and you might plot them. But it's much better to throw a dynamic of risk appetite in there and be able to say, well, OK, we can see our high risks, we can see our medium risk, and we can see our low risk. But imagine if we understood that some of those high risks are actually OK, because invariably we're quite hungry for that type of risk. But we may have risks that are sitting in the middle of our spectrum, those ambers, as we might call it, or even in some cases greens, which we feel quite comfortable with, and they don't get airtime, but in fact they already sit outside our risk appetite. So understanding that and getting that profile and volume of risk helps us understand better what we can do, what we can't, and decisions we can make. So I think risk appetite provides a different dynamic for reporting on risk above and beyond what is, low, medium, high, which we're traditionally used to. So I think playing it through to decision committee reports, using it as a mechanism for better and informed reporting, I think is a good way to go, and making sure you've got a clearly defined risk appetite statement, which is communicated out, but subject to review. I did say I was going to pick up some areas and things that were coming through on risk appetite statements that I'd seen recently, just so you can get a feel for the type of thing that we might be talking about there. Bear with me while I piece through my notes. Oh, there we go. I'm usually this disorganized, as you can see. Right, okay. Let's some things here. Okay, so typical headline risk appetite themes that we see come out, and this is an organisation that's involved in provision of services, of course, in the public sector. So the type of thing they were talking about there is this board have got together and thought about the themes that they would want to have have an appetite around. So they've talking about enabling community transformation. And the whole point there is you might say that sounds like an objective, but not necessarily. The objectives are obviously very defined on what the business is looking to achieve, but by creating a situation where you might say, well, one of the things we're really interested in from risk appetite theme is enabling community transformation. What does that mean to us? Can we play that through into our decision? And they were suggesting in this instance they had an open risk appetite to that. There was a larger explanation around that. Other things that came into that were achieving digital transformation, ensuring an efficient internal control and compliance environment, ensuring financial resilience, creating the right culture, capacity and capability, and the ability to be agile and shift focus in response to policy and political change. If you start communicating those elements out, then you're in a much better position to report and say what the impact could be on decisions. Equally, think about my triumvirate at the beginning, the Holy Trinity. You could convert those to a set of strategic risks as well, because they are important to the board. So you start getting a real natural alignment. So things to think about coming up, not COVID, right? So COVID's just one aspect at the moment. We've got Brexit rumbling along. That's going to play through into your risk profile, of course, and the implications thereon. Your attitude and your appetite for risk might change there. I think we're going to see, obviously, as a result of what's going on now, massive austerity measures, okay, in the future. We've got to be prepared for that. I think we've not even hit this, the economic downturn yet. Rishi's putting the economy in a coma, I think is the common phrase that's being used. I think we've still got that to come. So we've got to be prepared for that and implications for our services, our suppliers, our customers, and our stakeholders. I think we're going to see societal change in values. And I think that's going to be driven by COVID and what their expectations are. We're seeing, potentially we're going to be a cashless society soon. What does that mean? I think we're going to see accelerated use of tech. Everybody's now working from home. We're all here now working from home. I think we're going to see technology changing again more rapidly to accommodate the way in which we provide services. And I do think two other aspects that are creeping along here that have been about for a while. I think we're going to see new forms of governance. Governance is raising itself up the agenda again. There's no doubt about it. I'm a big believer in good governance. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's sort of like dropped off the agenda a bit. I think with COVID, it's been pushed forward again because people are realizing as boards, they need to ensure they're in a proper position to direct and control, because they were caught on the hop in many places, although they responded quite well. And the other one, of course, is climate and environmental. Let's not forget that. That is never going to go away. So I've taken you through a bit of a canter this morning, as I always do, on my thoughts around risk appetite. But what I think the one thing I will say here, going back to my description, it's slippery. There is no way in which you can necessarily describe it and deal with it. An appetite statement is a good part, a good process and means of communicating it out on one platform, because regulators will ask probably. But do have the conversation around a boardroom table. What is risk appetite? What is our risk appetite? What does it mean to us? How do we want to change it in any way? So I'm going to leave you there and open it up for questions. I've probably gone on a bit longer than I should have done, as expected. Over to you.